looking forward to understanding what the future of civil society is in this day and age. I request my colleague Anushri to introduce and open the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Gauri. A very warm good afternoon to one and all here. I am Anushri Tiwari from TRIF, and I am very happy to welcome you all for this session. I request our eminent panelists to be seated at the dais, please. Thank you. After listening to such insightful sessions and wonderful panelists today, we have another interesting session lined up for you around the future of civil society, a topic of deep abiding engagement for all of us, and most importantly, of a healthy society. I'm humbled to introduce our exceptional panelists with you today. Let me begin with Mr. Apoorva Oza. He is unable to join us in person due to some exigency, but he is with us from Ahmedabad. And most of us know him or have known of him in our journeys, an inspirational leader of the Indian CSO community. He has moved in pivotal roles as Global Program Lead, Aga Khan Foundation, after leading Aga Khan Rural Support Program India for 21 years. And I'm very happy to share that I have the privilege to invite Sir here, and I have started my journey in the development sector being guided and mentored by him. So, and he is still like the guiding light and inspiration for many young leaders like me. So thank you so much for being here, sir. Please feel free to clap. It feels good. It encourages us to speak. Thank you. Next, we have with us Ms. Dhruvi Shah. Thank you so much for joining the panel today, ma'am. She's the curator and author of The Book of Aspiration, a collection of inspirational memoirs from social leaders, a must read for all of us. She is at present the executive trustee and chief executive officer of Axis Bank Foundation and sector's go-to person for ideas, inspiration, and encouragement. Let me also share that she was one of the first persons to believe in the idea of TRI and shaped operational design of multidimensional change and engagement. She has over 24 years of experience spanning banking, microfinance, and rural development. Ms. Rashmi Shukla Sharma is former Indian Administrative Services Officer and alumnus of Delhi and Princeton universities, from where she has earned her MPhil and a master's in degree in public administration, respectively. She has held senior positions in the Union Government and Government of Madhya Pradesh, apart from various field-level posts in early part of her careers. In the course of her service, she has acquired in-depth knowledge and experience in school education and local government. She is the author of Elementary Education System in India, a field-based investigation of institutional structures, processes, and dynamics. A prolific writer and public intellectual on governance and public policy matters. She is the board member of TRIF with us. Thank you so much for your presence, ma'am. Please give a big round of applause for the panelists. Next, we were supposed to have Professor Phansalkar with us, but due to some family emergencies, he is not a part of this panel today. But all of us know him here, and we are very thankful for his guidance and support into the journey with us. Now, this amazing panel is moderated by the wonderful Miss Neelima Khetan. She is the partner at Nous Consultants and the visiting fellow at Center for Social and Economic Progress. She has an exceptionally eclectic and envious career. Chief Executive of India's most respected CSO, Seva Mandir, Country Director of American India Foundation, Director CSR and Sustainability for Coca-Cola, leading the Group CSR Head for Vedanta Group and guiding 11 business units for CSR across India and Africa. As this wasn't enough in one life for one person, she also served as acting director of her alma mater at IRMA for almost 10 years and is the co-editor of the book Anchoring Change, a book that documents remarkable stories of social transformation over the years, published by HarperCollins on the 75th anniversary of India's independence. So welcome, ma'am, and thank you for being the moderator. Other than this, there is not going to be any more spoilers from my side. And it is a blessing to hear from all of you. And so thank you very much for joining It is going to be an illuminating discussion in person and digitally. The session is live across Facebook, YouTube, and our partner channels. We have cue cards on each table, and please record your observations, questions on the session. For digital audience on Zoom available with us, post your questions in the Q&A and comment observations in chat. We will periodically collect them and share them with Neelima ma'am to incorporate in the discussions. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Anushi, for totally embarrassing most of us. But thank you very much. Thank you for having me here, and a very, very warm welcome to the panelists. And I'm really looking forward most to chatting with you. So just a few words to set the tone for the session, and then we get into listening to the panelists. So this session is about, as of course the title is, the future of civil society. And during the course of the next hour and 15 minutes, we'll attempt to first try and unpack what is the meaning of civil society and why is civil society important, or what is the role that civil society is supposed to play in a democracy like ours. So we'll first try and unpack that a little bit. And so talk about what is civil society and what is or what ought to be the role of civil society in a democracy such as ours, and then talk about what is the current context in which civil society organizations are operating, the context both in terms of what is the space context and what is the support context. Both of those contexts we should look at, and then within that context, then talk about what could be the future of civil society organizations, or what ought to be the not that the present should define the future. So you can do as much of, kind of open sky thinking as you'd like. So that's what we will attempt to cover in this session. And I also want to thank TRIF for thinking of this session. I feel there can be no more important conversation than this conversation on the occasion of completing 75 years of India's independence. There was a vision around which this country was formed. It is a democracy, and most thinkers over the last, I would say, when did Tocqueville? That was 1830. So almost for 200 years, thinkers have repeatedly gone back to what Tocqueville wrote in 1830 about the role of civil society in the running of democracies such as ours. And I will just like to quote one or two things from what Tocqueville had written. And this was despite from that time to this time, this question of course, maybe before I go on to what he said about civil society, what is the meaning of civil society? At least I think it ought not to be only the registered organizations that constitute civil society. Civil society is much broader than that. And anyways, I'm sure we'll come to that part of the conversation when we speak to the panel. But there is an inherent, when you talk about this diversity of players, with it comes an inherent kind of messiness and rough and tumble and diversity of the players. But despite all that, like I said, just to quote a little bit of what Tocqueville wrote, so he warned against only top-down solutions in a democracy. So he said, what political power could ever substitute for the countless small enterprises which American citizens carry out daily with the help of associations? As many of you may know, he had traveled to America and then was writing after visiting how this American democracy was functioning. And he said this, that what political power could ever substitute for the countless small enterprises. And he said that the more government replaces associations, the more individuals will need government to help as they lose the idea of association. So it becomes a kind of a vicious cycle. The more government replaces associations in its functioning, the more individuals will then depend on government because they lose the idea, lose the experience, the idea of how to associate and solve problems themselves. So we can go back to more of these, but I just wanted to lay this kind of overarching philosophical kind of a context. And in India's own 75 years of history, if we say that, there is this triad of the state, market, and civil society, or like TRIF calls Sarkaar-Bazaar or Samaj. Between those three legs of the stool of the country, there's never been perfect kind of balance. There never will be perfect balance. There cannot be perfect balance. Perfect balance is a mirage. All of us spend our lives looking for balance in everything, so also in a country. But if within that, if I were to broadly, and Rashmi is sitting here, and today actually the panel represents all three legs of this triad. There's Rashmi, who represents, well, in some ways, experience of the state, Dhruvi with experience of the bazaar, and there is Apoorva. You can get no better representative of the Samaj than him. So if you were to broadly look at the last 75 years, maybe immediately after independence, everyone had pinned their hopes on this new government, which was our government. And therefore, maybe in the years after that, and I'm saying, Rashmi, everyone, please correct me, there was much more that was pinned onto the state, and there was much more that was led by the state. To now, where I think we've begun to believe that the solution for everything lies in the market. Every kind of, whether that's, of course, production, but even if it is health, education, everything seems to, and in between, somewhere we've lost the sense of our own legacy of the rich Samaj, which India has. So anyways, let me stop here. And Apoorva, don't mind. It's not because you are there, but I just want to begin with maybe the Sarkar contest, because like I said, they were the ones who started off. But if you don't mind, Rashmi, just wanted to start with you, your thoughts on just this first part of the conversation as to what is civil society, and this triad in terms of what should be the role of Samaj when we talk about countries like India.
Thanks, Neelima. Am I audible? Yeah. So thank you. Of course, I don't know if you should have started with me, but because I think there are more qualified people sitting here to talk about civil society. But I have had the good fortune while working in government to interact with a lot of civil society actors and some of the finest in this country. I am one of those, one of the, what I've read, I'm not a theorist on this, but that civil society emerged along with the state. So you really cannot have civil society without the state. So it's a kind of parallel to the state. The whole idea of a civic life, I think, involves both the state as well as civil society. And I think we also ought to remember that even the Indian state owes its existence to a large extent to civic action, along with political action. So it's not only political action, but various kinds of civic action that led to the whole idea of the Indian states, its political aims, its, what it would do. Like, for instance, if you look at this whole thing about rural development and so on, and you can find traces in Gandhi's, various kinds of village plans and other kinds of plans. So the place of civil society in our country is very, very important. It has been historically. What we have not understood, I think, is the value. Okay. So, in fact, I would like to point out that even a lot of the initiatives in government, and I hope to come back to this at some point, I have a suggestion to make, but right now I'll only say that you look at a lot of the initiatives in government and they have their roots somewhere in some civil society organization doing something on the ground. Even the ASHA, for instance, comes from, livelihood is an obvious example, so I'm not quoting it. But the ASHA comes from health, experiments in health that were carried out by several NGOs. A lot of the teacher training that has happened at various points has come out of what people have learned from NGOs. So historically, and several other things, I mean, I would not even be able to be able to count all of them. So historically, I think civil society has made a very, very critical contribution in the Indian state itself. Apart from which I will not comment on because I don't have enough experience of how it has developed citizens and how it has countered the excesses of the state. I will leave that to other people. I am not qualified for that, but I am speaking a little bit from the state's point of view. But I think what is very important is that the role is there, but we don't understand the value of this role. And I think somewhere we need to correct that in various ways. And I do hope that you will give a little time to also talk about how do you sort of get the value of this role onto the board. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rashmi. And I think that's an important distinction that you made, and I underlined that probably there's a recognition of the role, but that's different from recognizing the value. And we need to talk about. So thank you very much, Rashmi. And Apoorva will get the last word. So Dhruvi, I wanted to ask you in this context, one, do you agree or do you think that we are now currently in a situation where markets have got more primacy than the other two legs of this triad? So A, do you agree? And do you think that that's kind of a right shift? That's what should be, and anything else that you'd like to say on civil society?
Yeah, so it's why it's good to have these conversations. It gives the opportunity to stand out, stand away, and sometimes just look at the whole piece in as a third party. And I think this was a good opportunity. So I don't think, the market exists in a society, and the Samaj, as we call it, and the entire relevance of the market comes for ease of transactions and ease of access. I think what the market has then done is made it inequitable for people, made it inaccessible, created more exclusion rather than inclusion. And that's how the market kind of has shaped up, and it's become popular, and it's shaping up like that, right? That is where it's leaving the spaces where not everybody is benefiting out of it, neither as a consumer and neither as a shareholder. And therefore is the whole isolation from the Samaj, which is why it becomes like a parallel pillar and not a part of it. Because today, honestly, the consumer can drive a lot of things, right? They have the purchasing power, they have the decision-making power, but somewhere that does not seem to be happening, which is making market more powerful. But most recently with SGDs and ESG, and that's a hope for the future, is how much will happen in terms of removing the inequalities, fighting climate change, making inclusivity as the base for everything. But at least from the design and the intent, what we hear from the investors across the globe, not just in a bank or anything, is drive, at least look at those indicators as the way a business should function. But it's going to take a lot of time to reach to that never ideal stage. But on the other side, I do see consumers becoming more conscious, not all. And will, in a country like India, will it reach that level of accountability in the Samaj where everybody is holding the government, the Sarkar and the market accountable for what it's doing to the society and to them? I think there is a very, very long way to go. And that is where the role of civil society becomes even more important in this particular context.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dhruvi. So what I hear you say that, so while you said very clearly that the market has also leads to inequity and exclusion, but you're also saying that maybe there's a shift occurring because the consumer, possibly you are saying that the consumer can become more demanding, is probably become, at least that's what one hears about the millennials, certainly, that they are a very different kind of people and they're more demanding in their, and demanding good ethical behavior from companies, what you said about sustainability, climate change, SDGs.
Investors into the market.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The investors into the market are demanding ESGs, environment, governance, and social aspects, and at a very, very fast rate, deciding how investments should shape up things at the bottom of the pyramid. Again, how will it shape up? What will happen will still unfold in the next couple of decades, I guess.
So, thank you, Dhruvi. And I think maybe, Apoorva, that's a very good segue for you to come in, because I think one role of civil society that often kind of people suggest, people like to think that should be the role or give it that role is holding others accountable, holding the market accountable, holding the state accountable, in what Dhruvi also said just now, that, Samaj can hold the markets accountable or Samaj can hold the state accountable. That's one aspect of the role of civil society. But I've heard you before, Apoorva, and others also, but are there other roles that civil society has, at least what you heard when Tokil was talking about it? It was, as I've understood, it's not just about holding the other accountable, it's also about yourself. And so anyways, Apoorva, over to you. If you can say whatever you think about the triad and the balance, and but also in terms of the role of civil society.
So, I was just thinking, curiously, both the common definitions of civil society have been what it is not, largely, right? So either we are, it's called NGO, so we are not the state. So out of this triad, either you are not the state, and that is one way we are defined, and the other is we are not the market, so non-profit organizations. So the civil society is therefore very clearly positioning, or has been defined as something which is not the state and not the market, and therefore it's this mix in between. There are two parts to it, and in fact it's so diverse that there are a large number of informal parts of civil society, and this whole farmers agitation which was there had both formally organized trade unions and farmers cooperatives, but a large number of informal. So you have a non-organized or non-registered sort of whole space. A lot of the movements, the anti-NAM movement, a lot of the movements which are there, the CHIPCO, they were not necessarily all registered, so to say. And there's been a lot of registered organizations, co-ops, Societies Act, etc. But registration alone is in our country, because it's so broad, it's a misnomer. So you really can't compare a small non-profit working in, let us say, Jharkhand with BCCI, which is also registered under the same act. So you have this legal space which is there. And so to me, the key issue is therefore the intent. So more than the legal space, whether you are societies or cooperative, or for profit, non-profit, but it is the intent, and the intent as shown not only by statements but by action. And that is actually, to me, the only way you can, in our country where there is this confusion of registration, etc., that is the way you can carve out what civil society is, both formal and informal, but largely by intent. And I think the role, one is, of course, to hold a state and market accountable. Of course, the problem with this is that since civil society, there is nobody who gives either the market or the state fund civil society. And then you need to have an exceptionally generous market and a visionary state which says, yes, I need dissent, I need questioning, and therefore I will fund them despite them questioning me. Now that generosity is, as we see, both from the market and from the state, has been declining over a period of time. And therefore, civil societies, this questioning, the funded civil societies' role of questioning has sort of declined. But fortunately, there is a whole non-funded voluntary space which increasingly holds the state and the market accountable. And therefore, civil society is enriched by this combination of funded, non-funded, registered, non-registered. In addition to this accountability space, I think there is a huge amount of contribution of civil society, which I think both the panelists have referred to, but has not been valued or recognized. And to me, almost it is what is called civil society actors are problem solvers. So they are the problem solvers of those who are excluded, both largely by the state and by the market. You see, the market is, yes, become more democratic and consumer, but finally the consumer is the one who pays. That then they become a consumer. A citizen, all citizens are not consumers. Only those who purchase and have the capacity to purchase become consumers. There's a whole body of people who cannot purchase many things, and therefore they are not even consumers, and therefore they are excluded. And who speaks on their behalf? Who gives answers, solves their problems? In COVID, we saw both the market and the state collapsing in many ways. That is when you saw civil society coming to the fore, right? Because they were the voice. Huh? And civil society, both informal resident associations and NGOs, and huge number of people came in. So one part of that is that problem solving, and this problem solving is, as I think one panelist, has led to so many innovations which are now being scaled up, whether it's the Asha worker, which is the first SHG started by Mairada, which is the hand pump, which is the biogas started by AFPRO, which is the first artificial insemination started by BIAF. Hajar innovations have been there in this space, both in the education space, health space, every space. These innovations have come from what? It's not as if they were like all, most brilliant minds, but they were the most committed, perseverant hearts and souls trying to solve a problem. And in that process, they innovated and solved the problems. And then those problems the solutions went to the state, and the state scaled some of them, didn't scale some of them, whatever. But that is, I think, a huge contribution. I mean, I can almost guarantee you, and I do this, that you can, if you know civil society history, you can go to a village, and the top 10 things you will see in a village, they are all by the state, but they owe all their origins to some innovation, some contribution by civil society. But unfortunately, civil society has never claimed this innovation, has never patented or registered or talked about it. So actually nobody knows. But that is there. That is the contribution of civil society, one of the contributions of civil society to nation building as we know it, especially for those who are excluded. Who, for example, first started working on domestic violence in households, civil society players. Then it becomes an act, then somebody does. Who started talking about forestry protection? Civil society players. Then it becomes FRA and all that. So all these key issues which urban, rural, the poor and the excluded and the vulnerable have faced in this country, some civil society somewhere has gone, tried the best to solve the problem, address the problem, highlight the problem, voice the problem. And that's one major role which civil society plays. Neelima, you know me, so I can go on and on. So you stop me.
Maybe we'll bring you back in, Apoorva. Thank you. So I think just to close off this round and move to the next round, I think maybe 2 points I want to say. I think one, from what Apoorva was also saying, it's interesting that after 75 years, after so many years of having experience of democracy, somewhere in any of these conversations, I feel that, or conversations, civil society kind of lives under this, there seems to be almost constant requirement to justify our existence. So either like Apoorva said, we justify that by saying that, hey, look at, like you also told Rashmi, first thing that you said, look at the string of successes that have been mainstreamed, which all owed their genesis to civil society. Or of course, the other, like Dhruvi was saying very nicely that, there needs to be more voices coming from consumers, from civil society to hold people on the straight and narrow. But there is this, in most of these conversations, nobody asks, there's no need for the state to justify why it exists. There's no need for the market to justify or provide any justification. But civil society organizations need to kind of subconsciously, we feel that we must justify our existence. And I also feel that that's why we then fall into saying, counting that how many trees did we plant and how many ditches did we dig and how many women did we train and all of that. Whereas if you go back to the idea of civil society, it was not just the tangible of what we did, but just the experience of citizens doing things on their own. That built capabilities, that broadened perspectives, that changed so much else. So the indirect contribution of civil society through the act of building associations which were doing things, that doing could be protesting, that doing could be solving a problem, but in that act, there was something else that was changing. That indirect is, of course, now lost. And one reason could be, like Apoorva said, that because civil society ends up depending on the other two for its existence in terms of money. Therefore, I think that sense of justifying. So anyways, and maybe quickly, just one more point which Apoorva had touched upon, and I'll just touch upon is this, bogey of course, you said about what falls under civil society and what does not. And the only count of civil society, extensive count of, well, I don't know, quote unquote, civil society organizations done in the country by the Central Statistics Organization, which put out this famous figure of 31 lakh NGOs in the country, which is with all due regards to the CSO for having undertaken a mammoth exercise, but it's a very flawed number. That 31 lakh comes from counting every single organization registered in the Societies Act, Trust Act, and Section 8, Section 25 earlier, from the date the acts had come into being. So from whenever, whether those organizations are alive or dead, you count all of them, that's 31 lakh, out of which the Central Statistics Office went and visited 22 lakh organizations, of which it found only about 7 lakh actually there. So 1/3 of the organizations that were visited were actually, but we live with that number of 31 lakh always. So anyways, I'm just saying, and that in any case, like Apoorva was saying, that number has a lot of act of omission because lakhs of self-help groups in the country are not part of it. Lakhs of federations, farmers are not part of it. So it's
cooperatives.
Absolutely, Apoorva. So it's a strange number, but that's the, but I must stop and let's move to the next. And this time I'm going to start with Dhruvi. So the next is to touch a little bit about what is the current context within which we are talking about civil society organizations. What are you seeing, Dhruvi? Dhruvi is interacting with civil society organizations all the time. So what are you hearing about the context, their pain, or their reality, whatever it is, Dhruvi? Over to you.
So one, kind of previously from what Apoorva Bhai said, is civil society and civil society organizations. We interchangeably use them. I think in the pure definition perspective, not just what we call as NGOs, CPOs, associations, faith-based organizations, foundations are all part of the civil society or the civil society organization. So we also need to acknowledge their presence and their work. They don't necessarily all align in their purpose all the time, but they all function. They are all a function of what people want to do together, right? So we also need to acknowledge the other set of organizations, like Sanjiv ji was at this thing. The CARP is a civil society organization, right? And it is an action by people for their society. So we need to acknowledge presence of these organizations also. The current context and a lot of angst is there. There are 2 or 3 kind of organizations as we see it is. One is an implementing organization. Now, an organization that is implementing something. Whereas the whole idea behind civil society organization was around advocacy, around trying to solve that problem, trying to highlight that problem and find solutions for it. Very much similar to what Apoorva is saying. But now what we see is a lot of them are implementing organizations. And I think the change started happening at the time, much before CSR became a law. It's probably started happening when the Millennium Development Goals were designed, wherein it became all about reaching a target, completing something, and the perceived burden fell on the NGOs who were probably most closest to finding a solution and who also had all the solutions, but could never scale up because neither the market supported and neither the government programs were supporting. This further got strengthened with SGDs, where again, the first few years of SGDs were also about implementing, again, what Millennium Development Goals could not achieve successfully. Again, the burden fell on the NGOs who were doing it. And then the CSR law happened, which made that implementation the only mandate, right? And if you look at the section Schedule 7 of the CSR,
Schedule 11.
Schedule, sorry, 135 Schedule 7, it's all about implementation, right? It leaves no space for advocacy. Perceived space for advocacy is what I see, but there is still a lot of space for advocacy. But what has happened is the space is getting now divided. There is a need for advocacy and there is enough being generated for advocacy. However, there is a sense of hurry. There is a sense of competition. And we're all trying to do the same thing sometimes. And it's from within the civil society, and now I'm probably narrowing it down to organizations that implement in a certain manner. I think it's the time to come together and claim a stake on the advocacy piece. Because if we are here to, again, by here, I mean the civil society space, is time to probably relook at things slightly differently for the future and not lose the space in itself. Because we will have to implement. That's how the funding is coming. There is a need to implement. Today, if you ask people that, do you want to wait and do this in a certain manner, or should we just do this here today? I'm sure the answer is going to be let's do this here today and let's not wait for trying to do it for tomorrow. And that's the sense of urgency we see everywhere. And that's where it's time for people to come together, people in the civil society space to come together, which includes self-help groups. I mean, I don't know the number, but we keep hearing this 8 lakh, 9 lakh, 10 lakh, 80 lakh numbers. And these are your next, how should I say, units of people or CSOs on the ground who have the potential to own the space. And are we even seeing this as an opportunity to use this platform for the next set of changes that need to happen? And advocacy is necessary. And how do all the operating organization in this space come together for advocacy? Because there is a lot that can happen together. And the space is honestly getting too divided for its own good. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dhruvi. I think, sobering end of what you end toward. So I'll maybe go to Apoorva before going to Rashmi. And because, Apoorva, this is a question on which you can write a whole book. So I'm going to ask you to just talk about arbitrarily, I'm saying, just mention 2 of the most significant kind of features of the current context for civil society organizations that you see. And I'm saying again, Apoorva, I know on the context, there is so much that you can write and what is happening to civil society organizations. But if you were to just pick 2 of the most important ones, and then we'll go to Rashmi and then there is one more round and then the audience round after that. Yeah. So Apoorva, just 2 of the top most things.
So one thing which one sees across most civil society organizations and the way they are supported, funded, state, is what I call the projectization of development. So all developmental work is sort of projectized into very very predictable outcomes, etc. So in a 3-year time frame, quarterly budgets, fixed line items, dedicated staff. That is a thing which is happening, and of course it's very ironical that it is happening at a time of tumultuous change. So you have projects which can't produce, they can't predict what climate change does, what floods do, what COVID does, but your whole your space of negotiation of funding is in the project mode. And I think the CSR amendments and all actually drag them in that corner, because now CSRs are also supposed to have 100% burn rate and all that complications which come with that. So that's one part. So there's a huge projectization, and it is telling on organizations that you, as an organization leader, you are constantly working with staff who are defined and measured by projects, but we want them to be a part of a larger mission and larger values and organizational identity, and that's a constant tension which all leaders, and a lot of innovation there to manage that, but leaders are dealing with this. So one is a projectization. The second part is, I think, I think the communities have actually grown much more than was typically assumed. So farmers getting together, them accessing media and looking at new innovation. I mean, women raising their voice and going on, adapting digital technology. So there's this huge thing which you see at the community level, which is in a way the positive part, is that there is also, of course, a lot of exclusion, a lot of oppression, a lot of that is also happening, but people are talking about it. So it is not as if things are rosy at the community. Things are really bad, but earlier they were silent and nobody would talk about it. You could go to work in a village for 10 years and nobody would talk about domestic violence. Now you will hear, it will come up in some meeting, somebody will make some noise. So that, I think, is what I call the positive side of what's happening. Unfortunately, projectization prevents ability to respond very well to this changing community. I mean, that's part of the problem. But I think that is there. The third, let me add a third one, which I think is that there is so little support for, we'll talk about the second impact of civil society organizations and civil society was the citizenship creation. That a secondary effect of the associations was creating citizens who are aware and who would work for others, either out of altruism or out of enlightened self-interest, but they would do for others. They would associate with each other. And that requires non-measurable process support and community organizing of the old-fashioned way. And I think that is increasingly becoming, it's difficult. People are doing less of it because the funding for it is again projective. So you will get collective funding if you promote 100 SHGs or 3 FPOs or 2 something. So it's not collecting citizens for addressing their problems. It is collecting citizens for what we assume, and they will agree to be their problem, which is either microfinance or agri-economy or something, right? So that is, I think, a major gap, and that reduces innovation, and that reduces the power of questioning and dissent and challenging patriarchy and all those things which used to emerge from that open-ended community mobilization approach. I think that is suffering. Yeah, three.
Thank you so much, Apoorva. That was fantastic. And also trust Apoorva to also within these pick the shoots of hope, because what you said, you're so right, Apoorva, that amidst all this kind of, dumbing down of development that's happening on the one hand, on the other hand, you see kind of really fascinating kind of response mechanisms that are like you said, the communities have probably now gone far. So thank you very much, Apoorva. So turning to you, Rashmi, you started with saying that, how much has civil society contributed to nation building and all that. And everyone, you, like Apoorva said, you just go one step behind in the history of that intervention, and you will see that somewhere, so everyone sees that. And yet the relationship of the state with civil society, so in terms of giving space and, what the current context is, and I'm saying, Rashmi, it's not just that the current kind of state is not encouraging of nonprofits or civil society. It's been a trend. Huh? It hasn't happened overnight. It's been a trend where the state is uncomfortable with having independent voices, with having civil society. So it's a kind of a contradiction, it's oxymoronic kind of situation that on the one hand, you are seeing that so much is coming out of it, and yet the state is. So what is your take on that?
Okay, thank you, Neelima. Just one off the cuff sort of remark. When we've been talking about what is civil society, I think we are talking, there is very off the cuff, let me make a classification that one is, civil society like cooperatives and SHGs where people are doing things for themselves. And the second is where people are protesting or, holding the state accountable. And the third, I think, which we are really trying to talk about is where people want to bring about larger changes in society. So it's not about themselves or it's not about simple protest, but you want to change society. And maybe we are all somewhere talking about the third, this thing. If you look at, to some extent, I think that to understand how the state has treated civil society or is treating civil society, you have to look at the state itself. Okay, so one thing that we have to look at is that in the 1950s and 1960s, we were a very resource poor state, but we were a ideologically fairly coherent and, sort of, there were ideals and so on, at least the state affairs. You have to look at two important developments since then. One is what has began in the 1970s, well documented, was the rise of rent seeking by the state. Okay, and I think that has a very important relationship to all the very important impact on all the relationships of the state to all kinds of actors, including civil society. And the second very critical development is the post-liberalization phase. I'm not talking about what happened in the economy and industry. By all accounts, our growth has increased and so on and so forth. I'm talking about something that we don't talk about very much, that this idea that came after liberalization, that the state needs to shrink. Okay, so I'm not talking about what happened in the economy. I'm talking about what happened inside government. With this whole idea of new public management, those who are aware of this. But anyway, we don't have to go into jargon. But this whole idea that government expenditures on itself should be contained, and generally government expenditures should be contained. And at this time, one idea that you find very strongly, and it exists today also, I mean, you go to most government offices, they will quote it. One is that the private sector is efficient, so work through the private sector. And second is work through the NGO sector, where you can't work with the private sector. And I think it is that I relate to what Apoorva has pointed to, this whole projectization. So in a lot of projects, there was this great fear that government should not hire more manpower. Okay, that's a very big dharma in government to this date. No more manpower, it will kill us. So you have to, but at the same time, in the late 1990s, our revenues began to expand tremendously. So we undertook more programs. And how do you do that? Well, if you're not going to hire more manpower, you associate with non-government organizations. And I think both these developments have impacted the character of non-government of civil society organizations of the kind that work with government. I'm not talking about the other kind. One is that this whole rent-seeking nexus, which has just grown, I mean, which it has grown even more after liberalization because government has had more money. So you will also see a lot of, none of the organizations sitting here would be like that. We are, this is the kind of elite of the civil society. But in the state, you will see a lot of small organizations which are involved in the rent-seeking operations with the bureaucrats. Okay, so you have one development. And the second, which Apoorva has already pointed out, is these NGOs which are implementing. Okay, so a project comes, you hire a certain number of NGOs, this kind of thing. So that is very different from, say, some of the NGOs that came up sort of to make an impact and then, may have collaborated with government and sort of given ideas to the government. So this is a very big change, and you'll especially find it among the smaller NGOs. And to that, I must add the current greater political polarization. We don't know how exactly that is going to play out. So I think these are two trends, 2 or 3 trends within government, which have changed the NGO scene and which I think would need to find out more about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashmi, and also for, I think, bringing out, I think you are very right to point about post-liberalization. I think there was a conscious kind of almost a mindset shift that government needs to step back and the market needs to take a step forward. And that's what happened. And then also interestingly, what you said with more. So although I feel, Rashmi, maybe we can come back to it later, but this uneasy relationship between the state and civil society, apart from, I think, one short period when it was thought that state should reach out and support, the point that Apoorva had made, why is it that nobody is willing to give? So the failed experiment of Kapat or other, but no serious effort has been made by the state to invest in civil society organizations if they are considered kind of healthy for the functioning of, we have till 3:15. Yeah. Okay. So just the last, which is the kind of crystal ball gazing round, which is, how do we look at what are these? So not just this broad question about what is the future of civil society, that is, I think, but I'm going back to Dhruvi and starting from Dhruvi, but I'm going to you, Dhruvi, because you are really seeing more than one. Huh? Many are, but I'm just asking you, Dhruvi, when you look at the future, what are some of the more interesting trends which you would kind of, say that these are the trends which I think are going to snowball in the future, or they will have, so anything that you are seeing of the future?
So two things which I would like to, one which is, like I said, that there are many new forms of both movements that are emerging, and social media has a role to play, and it has the potential to become more effective if reinforced in a certain manner. The second thing that I'm seeing, and I honestly believe and trying to do more around it, is can the self-help group play the role of citizenship in their own areas of influence, and very similar to what Apoorva Bhai was saying. And there is the leadership that is emerging. And again, a lot of it is, not a lot, most of it has come from the anchor organization, especially around building capacity of people, developing grassroots leadership. I think that has tremendous potential to develop citizenship, civil action, civil society within that local area. And that is a space I don't think we are seeing that as an enough potential, but it has a potential just beyond economic inclusion or livelihoods. I think the role that SHGs can play, not so much as the farmer producer organizations, but to be very honest, the SHGs and the federations. I think that's what is a very important element which has come out of all these years of work. And obviously, this whole struggle between finding time, money, and space for more of advocacy, for which there is a lot of desire and a need, and lesser of implementation. I think that balance has to be found out. And I'll again repeat myself. It's something that has to come from within. It's a choices a lot of organizations will have to make. Again, the organizations that have funding are in a position today to do things differently and make that difference, and sincerely try and have these conversations. And it's not easy. There is a lot of advocacy required within that, but maybe funders like us or others can try and do that. Technology, like I said, is going to play a very important role. Yeah, so these 3 or 4 things.
Thank you very much, Dhruvi. Very interesting points which Dhruvi said about the future. And I know Dhruvi's brought up this. I think she's betting a lot of money on these SHGs, and she's spoken a lot about, I've heard her before. And I also feel that those are more kind of grassroots people's civic associations, which maybe we haven't paid enough attention. And by the way, Rashmi led a large self-help group initiative or program, that you can call it, when she was in Madhya Pradesh. And so years ago, before so much of self-help group had happened. So maybe, Rashmi, I want to ask you also as to how do you see the future of civil society? And more particularly, kind of, I'm asking you that, but you can please respond in whichever way you want to say. Do you see the state playing any role in that future of, in a sense now, corporates have become part of civil society future because of this 2% CSR thing. No, in one way or the other, you'll have some role to play in that future. Maybe not all. SHGs probably don't. They same space. But in what way do you see the state playing any role in this future, or anything else? Now that you're more in an academic space, what do you see in terms of where civil society organizations are going and where the future is?
Let me give you a simple answer. I don't know. So, it's very difficult to predict what the political trajectory of this country is going to be. I mean, in fact, all our assumptions are now standing on their head. So it is really impossible to say how this country is going to go and what is going to happen to it, what its goals are. And I think the sort of state support or lack of it to civil society is going to follow that particular agenda. But if I can sort of diverge from your question and just make a couple of points, which is that, given that the political and other situations of various kinds, like tomorrow someone could come and finish off CSR, for instance. Okay, so what is the civil society or civil society organizations which intend to make a change in society doing to strengthen themselves? I think that is a question also that needs to be asked, because here are people who are in this uncomfortable place where they don't have the kind of authority of the state, nor the money of the corporate sector, but they plan to and do make certain initiatives. So how is it? It is very difficult for them to root themselves firmly, because as Apoorva was saying, and they are dependent on both these actors. So, but I really think that whether, there should be some exploration of how these organizations can increase their own space, a little more independent space. And really, I mean, I just off the cuff, I mean, I don't know if one should sort of talk so, sort of without thinking, but are there any funding models that exist across the world? And do we know enough about them other than, what we have today? Secondly, have we done enough to make people aware of the importance of the initiatives taken? For instance, have we even, I mean, today we talked about a lot of government policies having their origins in civil society work, but have we documented it anywhere? Or have we documented what civil society organized enough? Because if you talk to a lot of people who don't work in government or who don't work in related sectors, they may or may not be aware. And many of them, if they are aware, may support in various ways. And the third issue that I want to sort of highlight is that to what extent, we talked about SHGs, FPOs, these are very important citizen interfaces that we've been building up over the years. Now, organizations which are concerned with livelihood are, of course, in close touch with these. But how much are other kinds of organizations which work in health, education, how much are they using these platforms to magnify whatever work they are doing? So I'll end there. Sorry, Neelima, I didn't answer your question. वो जो होता है ना that मुझे तो काव पर ऐसे आता है तो I will, even though the question paper says उस चीज पे ऐसे लग, yeah, तो I have written.
But no, not at all. I think both the points I think that you made, Rashmi, one that I think we should think about other ways of, maintaining this autonomous space, because if it only depends on others, then there is that's a very nice challenge for all of us. And the second, one second pitch about the book. So what you said, there is, in this effort to document what's been the good that's been done in the last 75 years. So we've been part of, the book has just come out. It's called Anchoring Change. Rashmi was one of the advisors. Thanks to the money that Dhruvi gave, that book happened. So please look out for it after 15th August. It will be in the stands. But Apoorva, you have the last word on this future before we take audience questions.
Yeah. I think I agree with both what Rashmi and Dhruvi have said, and I see a range of seemingly contradictory trends emerging in the future. And I'm a believer then that finally what emerges is what the state and the individuals will determine. So let me just enumerate a few trends which I think will happen. One is that coalitions and collectives and associations of civil society organizations will increase. And they will increase because individually they have realized that they cannot cope with expanding state and a market which is also not fully understanding what they're all about. So they will need to come together, and they will come together. And I think they will, there will be 10 such coalitions, 5, 6 will collapse, but 4, 5 will continue and mature and become, and take up advocacy, take up research, take up a lot of things, which was the original role of a lot of the original roles of civil society. I see that trend happening. I also see a lot more what we call the funding scenario is going to be very interesting. So on one hand, you've just got the social stock exchange. Then I see a lot of retail funding will happen as the middle class becomes more aware and they want to do their own thing, whether to save a tree or, whatever, but things will happen. There will be, the carbon markets are an unknown quantity. They are just emerging, and they are right now not very fair to villagers who end up sequestering the carbon, but there will be some fight for getting more their fair deal. But I think carbon markets will emerge as a source of funding for many people, especially for rural areas where a lot of the sequestration is going to happen. So I see all that. I also see a lot more result-based funding, which was started initially, got different names for it, but largely you get funded based on the results which are measured by somebody else, etc. I think all those trends will increase as the money goes more. I will also see contradictorily, and I see it happening, a lot of volunteerism happening. And people they will say, I can give 2 days a week, I can give 4 days a month. I'd like to give this, I'll give this software on pro bono. And, forget the big NGOs, my wife and a lot of people who work with patients groups and the health sector, huge amount of work is pro bono and volunteerism. There is actually nothing, no structure, no money, nothing. And whether they are, rare disease or diabetes, or so, they are all voluntary and brilliant work being done. So I think volunteerism will just increase. People will do that, and that's a positive thing. I will also see, unfortunately, a lot of small organizations who were in the delivery space will actually start shrinking, or organization which cannot cope with this whole compliance burden which is now there. They will find it very difficult to raise funds. So I think some organizations go bigger, but a lot smaller ones will have survival or existence issues, unless, of course, the coalition then brings them along and supports them to bring up. But otherwise, this is likely to happen. I see, very contradictorily, and maybe hopefully so, I see a lot of, I think, as the pressure of forces on pluralism, on citizenship increases, there will be increased focus by many civil society on educating themselves and everybody else about the constitution and about making better citizens. I see that whole becoming now people have now realized, you take it for granted earlier that democracy was granted, voting was granted, citizenship was granted. Now you are realizing that you have to fight for it, and therefore civil society will respond, and in very innovative ways. I think this will increase and I will also see what we call a maturing of the CSR space. So there will be more people, but I think the ones who are there will now realize that projects have not really had the impact they thought. That once you get into the sector and go to the field, you learn. That's how we learned, and they will also learn.
सवाल पूछने की जगह छोड़ देना.
So this is my last.
Thank you very much for that list. It was really interesting. So we have 9 minutes, and maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and there are some questions that Anu ne meko Farra bheja. So I'll go to the Anushi Farra, but I don't know who to choose. Somebody help me, whoever's question. Everyone's is important. Maybe what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions together so that at least we hear what you have to say, and then we'll respond to it. Yeah.
Yep.
So the gentleman there, and there was this gentleman, and आप ही थे, और तो कोई नहीं था ना तीसरा. One lady, please. ठीक है. Okay, आपको पहले सवाल.
अच्छा. I just want to ask the panel. One is that the whole discussion we have seen, it is about the external environment for the CSO. But at the same time, there is a lots of crisis, and the CSO itself is in crossroad. That what is happening inside. When we are looking that almost at the same CSOs numbers are rising, but at the same time with the consulting agencies and others, the voices of the people are getting by. At the same time, we are also we are seeing that in this space that the institutional legacy is losing. That earlier long-standing organizations are losing the new way of coming. And the third space of it, what I'm seeing it, that with this, we are actually, once we are talking about the exclusion, but I think this sector is becoming more excluded itself. It is becoming English speaking, some high class people, citizens, drama field. So how we'll be seeing it in this future of civil society in that space?
Thank you very much. Fantastic question. बहुत बढ़िया. I'm very glad you asked it.
Thank you, Neelima ji, and the panelists. I can speak on behalf of the leadership team at Development Alternatives. This has provided so much guidance for us in terms of going forward. I was waiting quite eagerly for the panelists to also talk about the fourth sector of fourth estate, the media. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, particularly in terms of, how both by way of context or the future, civil society could work much more closely with media and social media, I guess, in particular. Yeah.
I'm Pallavi, and rather than question, I have a comment and a sharing of a small experience.
I'm sorry, Pallavi. Na? Don't mind. Please don't mind.
Yeah.
But अपन बिल्कुल संक्षिप्त में
हाँ एकदम
है ना,
संक्षिप्त
don't
एकदम
share.
संक्षिप्त. No, it won't be long.
So that we hear most
Yeah.
people.
Especially when Dhruvi was talking about SHGs and all, we as a TRIF and other organization has worked out that model in Barwani, and few of us have come together and we have reached at a place where, we need now to tune it to upscale. So there's something, if we can come out together and work out how we can upscale that whole thing. So that is what I wanted to mention, that lot has been already done with SHGs.
Thank you, Pallavi. That's important. There was one more gentleman who had raised his hand in case he still wants to ask that question. Otherwise, we'll go back to the panel. Okay.
Do we see a future? Sorry. Do we see a future in which government is able to fund some of the NGOs, like we have priority sector lending, which is given by banks to certain fields? So is there a scope for the government to give some of the fundings?
I am so glad you asked that question, because I was trying to ask Rashmi that, because it's not that there are no countries in the world who do that. There are countries where it happens. So anyways, I think fantastic array of questions, and I will now shut up. Sorry. अच्छा बोल दीजिए, जल्दी से बोल दीजिए, परंतु इसके बाद में बिल्कुल कोई इमोशनली मेरे को मत करिएगा, हाथ मत उठाइएगा, जल्दी से बोल दीजिए.
Okay, I am Arushi. So my question is that a lot of CSRs and government organizations and organizations like TRIF are working for all those things on the rural front. But we as youth of this country are not aware of this. So what is the transparency factor that should be brought into the picture, so that when social media is becoming, a movement, we youth can get up and become a movement and help in what you are contributing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad you spoke. So we have 4 minutes left, and I'm not coming in the way. Over to the three of you. Ek minute, Dhruvi.
Yeah, a couple of things to what Shank said and what you said, right? It's a very English-speaking audience, and that itself is creating exclusion, especially when you go to grassroots. So it's something, again, has to be done within all of us. And I think things have started happening. I think what the civil society needs to do together as one is communicate. We don't communicate to the world as a sector. We communicate about the organization. There is also in this space, there is a sense of loss of identity that is happening. I think for a minute we should leave that aside, and for the sector as a whole, this is the time, and I have been trying to have this conversation with our partners at least, is there something that can be done? Come together and talk about the issues, not about how you are solving it, but how we are solving it as a sector, and that kind of can give it a lot of strength. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll just, because there's only 1 minute, so I'll just talk about this government funding to NGOs. Certainly government funding to NGOs is possible, and at various times in this country also, some attempts, as Neelima was saying, CAPART and all, have been made. But I think one really cannot predict what would happen. It depends on how government itself sees civil society and the extent to which it encourages, it is comfortable with dissent, with
alternative voices, and so on and so forth. So, but if you look, I certainly think there should be government funding to civil society organizations, because as we've just discussed, that for a very, very practical reason that so many initiatives come out of these civil society organizations. And it should be there in a country like ours. It should definitely be there, where, very few, our understanding, in fact, I would say, I'll just finish with this, that civil society organizations, unlike other countries, civil society organizations are almost the only ones who actually work with people and are able to generate context-specific solutions. For instance, our academics are much more sort of distant. So we don't know so much about, what works, how things happen in civil society. So definitely I would always say that government should fund, but it also depends on a lot of things.
Thank you, Rashmi. Apoorva, 1 minute ka challenge hai.
Yeah. So, I think the question on both social media and youth, I think I entirely agree. I think there's a huge space, and I see always that when we have younger people in all organizations, they use social media far more effectively for communicating both with donors and also with the community. So I think that's a huge opportunity which we have, which I think we've still not tapped fully. And we've not tapped, and when I mention volunteerism, I see a lot of young people willing to volunteer. And it's up to civil society organizations to create enabling spaces for them to volunteer, give their time and feel happy and do something meaningful. And the last answer is that I think they raised a good point. This English elite thing, I think this is a exercise of self-reflection which every organization has to do. There is some pressure on, let's say, gender inclusion, which is there mandated in most of these donors, etc. But inclusion of tribals, inclusion of Dalits, inclusion of other excluded communities at the staffing level, at the board level, I think there's a long journey civil society has to cover. I don't think we've done enough introspection and we've not done enough action on this space. And there's a lot of work we need to do in this space. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Apoorva, and thank you so much, Rashmi, Dhruvi, and all of you. Honestly, I enjoyed this conversation. Every single second of it, this conversation was rich. And I know we didn't do justice to the topic, but you can't do justice to this topic in 75 minutes. But thank you, and thank you for those questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Sorry.